in the cultural history of photography, archives, and armed conflict. I'm also currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Victoria Libraries and the Centre for Global Studies, where I'm involved in several digital, archival, and photographic research projects. My colleague here, the soon-to-be doctor, Marc, Marin, Webb, and I are delighted to be here tonight to share one of these initiatives, the Sursil project, which is featured over there. It's an ongoing archival project about the visual history of the Yazidi community that we are launching this month. This evening, we're going to talk a little bit about the origin of this project, our current efforts and future plans, and more broadly about how this work fits into a much larger discussion around the importance of photography as a tool of memory, identity, and history. More specifically, we hope to introduce you to these types of archival works and how they can serve an important role in the aftermath of traumatic events like war and mass violence. But before I go any further, I'd like to note that tonight's presentation is part of a series of exciting connected events taking place this month in relation to the launch of the Sursil project. Over the next few weeks, there will be several exhibitions and events in Bashika Barzani, several locations in Sinjar and here in Erbil. These will not only include photographs from the Sursil project, but also musical performances from the very talented musicians from the Mirzo Band, who will be performing here tonight at 7 p.m. Our talk tonight coincides with the first public exhibition of a collection of rare photographs from the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, which you can see over here to the stage right. While Marc will go into much more detail about this specific collection, since the 1930s, these images depicting Yazidi life and culture in locations such as Sinjar and Bashika Barzani remained out of the public sight, hidden in the university archive. Remarkable not only for their visual quality and fidelity, the photographs also offer an incredibly rare view into everyday life in Yazidi villages in the early 20th century. I want to express that we are very thankful for the University Penn Museums for their efforts to not only digitize these rare photographs, but also allow us to bring them to you here tonight and exhibit them. If you're interested in looking at the other photos in the collection, there is a QR code on the other side of the exhibition wall. You can scan it with your phone and you can see all the photographs from yourself or download them for your own use. So moving on, just a quick little bit of selfless promotion for my host institution, the University of Victoria Libraries, who has generously supported this event and joined as a key partner on this project. Our team's work represents one of several archival projects at the University Library that work with participants to preserve and provide access to collections from underrepresented, historically marginalized communities in both Canada and globally. At UVic Library, there is a deep commitment to developing projects in Canada and internationally that seek to support community heritage and archival efforts at a grassroots level. This means not only working with communities to preserve and safeguard sometimes at risk material for future generations, but also allow this material to be made accessible for researchers and community members alike. This is incredibly important, especially within the context of Canada, as we address our own history of colonial violence with Indigenous populations. So with all that said, let me give you a bit of a roadmap of tonight's discussion. The talk will be divided into two parts. First, Marc is going to explain a little bit about the social lives of photographs displayed in this exhibition, give more of an explanation of our team's project and the work, and finally discuss the importance of photographs and the process of repatriating these images from institutional archives back to the Yazidi community. Following Marc's presentation, I will briefly wrap up with some concluding thoughts about the broader importance of archival projects in the aftermath of traumatic events. Finally, before I go on for too long, I'd like to importantly thank Catholic Relief Services for their help with planning and logistics, and also express our deep gratitude to the Goethe Institute in Iraq and their staff for supporting our work and partnering with us to make tonight's event possible and all these events this month. So without further ado, I would like to hand things off to Marc to discuss these remarkable images that are here, their cultural importance, and the story about how they ended up here tonight. So thanks.
شكرا جزيلا لسماحكم إلنا نقدم هذا المشروع اليوم. إحنا ممنونين لمعهد غوته لتنظيم هذا المعرض. مشروع استرسال هو مبادرة تعاونية غير حزبية مكرسة لتوثيق وحفظ ومشاركات التراث الثقافي الغني للمجتمع اليزيدي بالعراق. مشروع استرسال أسس فريق من تخصصات مختلفة من الباحثين والصحفيين والموثقين والمهندسين المعماريين والمصممين، ويهدف إلى حماية التاريخ البصري للمجتمع اليزيدي. وفي نيسان من هذا العام مشروع استرسال راح ينظم سلسلة من المعارض والفعاليات ذات الصلة لإطلاق المشروع على مود يكون موجود للمجتمع اليزيدي بالعراق. إن شاء الله كلمتنا راح تساعدكم تفهمون أهداف المشروع، وهسه على مود الكل يفتهمنا من هسه إحنا راح نكمل نحكي بالإنجليزي. So this project really originated from joining the efforts of multiple colleagues, both in Iraq and abroad, who have felt the interest in collecting photographs of the Yazidi community. This has been going on for some years now, and it has involved both the Yazidi community in Iraq and abroad, and a number of institutions, as Nat already mentioned, including the Goethe Institute, the University of Victoria Libraries, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and NGO Catholic Relief Services, who have provided funding and logistics for the exhibitions and the talks that are taking place this month. Especially Mizo Music Foundation, who will play on this same stage at 7 p.m. today, have also joined and organized live performances in Sinjar. In these performances, Fahad Harbo and his colleagues suggested that they could perform, they could compose music specifically for these events, inspired by the fact of this sort of activities and kind of reflecting on the importance of memory for the collectivity, for the community. So in these exhibitions / performances, Mizo Music will be playing songs, and the photographs will be placed next to the performances. They proposed this initiative to us, which we thought was a beautiful way to join visual memory and oral traditions, which, as we all know, are so important for the Yazidi community. So we hope that our talk will not leave you too tired, and that you will still have some energy after us talking to hear and to enjoy their performances as well. So, fantastic. So today we will explain the history of the photographs that you can see in the exhibition below. So this exhibition shows a subset of a much larger corpus of historic photographs that we have been collecting throughout around 12 institutional archives in the West. None of those were in Iraq. And so far we've located around 400 unpublished photographs of Yazidi towns in Iraq, some of which are most likely the earliest photos ever taken in these locations. So these photographs show aspects of daily life of the Yazidi community, including weddings, celebrations, funerals, domestic life, and so on, as you can also see in the exhibition below. And our project is now working with these institutions to digitize and to preserve this most important corpus of historical photographs, which we hope that will be of interest not only for the Yazidi community, but for everyone who has an interest in the history of the region. So the earliest photographs were taken in the late 19th century, including the first photos ever taken in Lalesh. Funny story, these photos were taken by a British missionary called Athelstan Rayleigh. And Athelstan Rayleigh went in 1886 to Lalesh with this old type of cameras that they used to use at that time. For that, they were using glass negatives. And glass negatives was a system that they basically had to clean the glass before and after the photograph was taken. And Athelstan Rayleigh wrote in his memories how when he reached Lalesh and he started doing these photographs, he made everyone in the valley angry because he was washing those glass negatives in the springs of the holy water that were around the valley. So basically, most of the oldest photographs that are preserved from these periods are indeed preserved only in negative form, not in prints. And those negatives are very fragile. So it's very important for us to work with these institutions to try to secure their digitization and to avoid losing this important part of Yazidi history. So today, however, we will only show the history of a subset of this larger collection. The photos included in the exhibition below are currently stored at the Museum of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia in the United States. So we have been working closely with the archivist of the museum, Dr. Alex Pezzati, and with the photo studio of the museum, who have been very generous in both digitizing a corpus of around 300 photographs who were never published, and have supported the efforts to repatriate this corpus of unpublished photographs back to the community. Most of these photos were done in the 1930s by a group of archaeologists who excavated in the archaeological sites of Tepe Gaura and Tel Bila near the towns of Bashik and Balzani. And they were led by Dr. Ephraim Speiser by the University of Pennsylvania. So the commitment that the University of Pennsylvania, and specifically the Penn Museum, has to repatriate these photographs actually does not happen in a void. On the one hand, it fulfills the museum's mandate towards decolonizing the collections and working closely with the communities of origin to repatriate materials that are relevant for them. But on the other hand, the rediscovery of these photographs right now also talks about the current history of this region and of the Yazidi community in particular. So in the aftermath of the Islamic State, in 2019, the University of Pennsylvania started collaborating in the conservation of the holy shrine of Sheikh Hadi in the Holy Valley of Lalesh. And I myself, as a PhD student of that university and with a background in architecture, was sent to assist the conservation of the conservation works. And they asked me initially to help reconstruct, study the history of the sites through travelers' accounts, so to accounts of people who had traveled into Lalesh and had described the place in the last 200 years, and also through non-published material. So this initial collaboration eventually led to a much larger project, led me to go to Bashika, led me to go to Sinjar several times, and finally my own dissertation project is much more involved with this than I should have expected at the beginning. So, apart from that, 2 years ago, our colleague Catherine Blanchard, who's the keeper of the Middle East section at the Penn Museum, she was actually studying the archives of Tepe Gaura, of this archaeological site in Bashika, and she happened to find a photo that you can see here, which is an old 1930s photograph of Lalesh, one of the oldest ones that we had found so far. And she immediately recognized that I had become obsessed with finding these sort of photographs, and she flagged that to me, and she told me, you should come to the archives, you should see this material. So we went down to the museum archives, and we were amazed by the amount of material that we found. So all of these photographs, you can get the size of the photographs, how we found them. Those prints are smaller than a telephone. And most of the times, the colleagues at the photo studio at the museum had to do a lot of effort, a lot of post-editing, to make sure that we can print them in larger sizes to fit exhibitions like this one today. You know? And so this brings us to one of the first questions of today's discussion. Why were these photos taken at the first place? So the University of Pennsylvania excavations at Tepe Gaura and Tel Bila took place between 1930 and 1937. And the excavators who took part of these excavations, they photographed not only the archaeological sites, but also daily scenes in the towns of Bashika and Fadeliya during that time, during almost a decade. They produced a lot of very relevant information to understand not only the ancient history of Mesopotamia, but documenting how was daily life during that period. So Tepe Gaura is an archaeological site that goes back to the 6th millennium BC, in what we call the Halaf period, and it was continuously occupied for over 3 millennia, until what we call now the Akkadian or Neo-Sumerian periods. That means that since it was continuously occupied, Tepe Gaura represents one of the most important archaeological sites in Iraq to understand the process by which societies led to eventually living into cities, so the development of urbanism. And it has also revealed many important aspects of how societies were organized and administered before the advent of writing, before cuneiform was invented. No? But luckily for us, Tepe Gaura and Tel Bila were placed next to Bashika and Bazar. And so the excavators of this site documented not only the archaeology, but many aspects of the daily life of these towns. However, these photos were never considered relevant for publication by these archaeologists, and thus they never saw the light until now. So these photos were eventually archived at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. However, the photos that did not relate to the archaeological sites, such as the ones in the exhibition here, were most of the times not even catalogued. So Ephraim Speiser, the director of the excavations, had in his office, in the museum, a box named Miscellaneous Collection of Folkloric Images. And he referred to those images as such, in his office in the museum. And after he retired, the photos were assembled together in the archives, but they were not organized. So we lost lots of information regarding the time and the place where these photos were taken, and also what they were showing. And this is what we call metadata. And so we understood that in order to understand the relevance of this collection, we had to try to reconstruct the metadata as much as we could with the available sources. And we did this in two ways. We went, first of all, to the archival museum, to the archives of the Penn Museum, to work with the notes that had been written next to the photographs or sometimes behind the photographs, although that was not common practice. And we complemented that with fieldwork in the same towns where these photos had been taken. So asking older people what we were seeing in the photographs, what were the shrines that we were seeing, if any person could be recognized in the photographs, etc. And it was precisely during this phase of the project that the local community started being engaged with this corpus of photos, and they often asked us to provide the physical or digital copies of these photos back to the community. And at that time, the Penn Museum started to initiate the process of digitization, which eventually led us here today. So the relevance of reconstructing this metadata is perhaps best revealed in the way it allows us to reconstruct personal lives of the people who were most closely related to the archaeological excavation. So this is a photo showing some of the workmen of the excavation house. The photo was taken in 1935 in the courtyard of the excavation house. And it noted that it included 4 people from whom we know the names and some aspects of their identity. We have Mehdi, who was a Christian. We have Khurshid, who was a Muslim Turkmen. We have Rashid Saduk, who was a Yazidi. And we have Heti, who was a Muslim Arab. And so in the next slide, good, those photos were actually taken 1 year later, in 1937. So we have the photos of this excavation year represent a window into the life of one of these persons that we saw before, the Yazidi Bashir Sadok. So the excavators provided ample documentation on the wedding procession, the ceremony, the celebrations of Bashir Sadok and his wedding with his wife, which we have included in the exhibition below, and we invite you to look at them more closely later. These photos include the procession that went from the house of the bride in Basani to the house of the groom in Bashika. We see the traditional dress worn by the bride. We see the dowry that was given by the groom's family to the bride in a form of a large chest that was transported by a horse from one town to the other, and the dressing gowns for both Bashir and his future wife. So these photos, no surprise, were among the most valued ones by the people with whom we shared the photos during our interviews. And we thus decided to include them in the exhibition and also emphasize them here in the presentation today. And this is not because only they were beautifully taken, so they have an aesthetic value, but they also have an historic value. They document how a whole wedding day took place 90 years ago. And from the locals' point of view, it was much easier to relate emotionally to these photos than to others. They stated very often how they felt themselves reflected in them, how they gave them a sense of historical continuity and a connection to the community. So other valuable documents that we found in the archive include photographs and drawings of both tangible and intangible heritage of most main Yazidi towns. These include Sinjar, also Lalesh and Bashika. Most of the shrines and these areas, except for Lalesh, were destroyed after 2014 and have been reconstructed. So we immediately understood the importance of not only digitizing these photos, but really bringing them back to the community. So it was even more important to do this right now. Just as a detail, these drawings were done by the architects of the excavation, who was Alfred Bendiner, who was actually also a caricaturist at that time. And they show tiwafs and jemayas, so yearly celebrations in the mazars in 1937 in Bashika. So at this point, we understood that the project had not only to include the cataloging of the photos and the digitizing, but really the repatriation of the photos back to the community to ensure their preservation for the future generations. But the limitations that we had is that some of these photos were only preserved in print. Most of the times they were only preserved in negatives. And most of these negatives were very fragile, they're very old. So sometimes we had these glass negatives. Other times, the second oldest set of photographs were done in something called nitrate negatives, whatever that is. It means that they were very fragile, and they were, so nitrate negatives burn, they burst if you don't preserve them properly. So eventually in the 1960s or 70s, the museum decided to kind of remove those from the archives and to generate these safety negatives, 35 millimeter negatives. It doesn't really matter, I don't know why I'm explaining this. But so basically explaining that throughout this process, many of these photos were lost because the copying of one type of negative to the other sort of negative also reduced the quality of most of these photographs. And that is to say that the photo archive at the museum has done an amazing job being able to reconstruct them to the quality that we have today in the exhibition. So thanks again to these guys, they did an amazing job. And this brings us here today. Fantastic. The moment that we are actually bringing the photos back to the community as a series of exhibitions and activities during this month of April. This is only thanks to the collaborative efforts of dozens of people, almost entirely volunteers, who have been able to organize these exhibitions all around. This is for you to give you an idea. This was my hand holding the photograph, and this is how much bigger we've been able to reproduce it in Bashika. So for all of you who next Tuesday on the 15th have nothing better to do, have a free time, and have an Iraqi visa, or a visa for federal Iraq, we invite you to go to Bashika because we will be exhibiting these photographs in large format in the street that connects both Bashika and Bazani, in that wall. And after the exhibition, these photographs will be given to the community as it has been asked, requested by them. So briefly finishing this description of the history of the photographs, this is a case study that briefly allows us to frame the discussion today around the multiple chapters that biographies of these images can show us. No? So we understand that images are created, they circulate, they're transformed, sometimes they're forgotten or they're censored. So it is not only important to reflect on why these photos were taken originally, by whom, when, and under which aims, and how this original context actually determined the window that these images represent to the past of the community in the region, but also it is relevant to ask ourselves why these photos were forgotten for such a long time, over 90 years. No? So as we saw, these photos were not considered relevant for the research that was taking place in the museum. This is a museum of anthropology and archaeology, but anthropologists and archaeologists during 90 years were simply not drawn to these images for their research. And as we mentioned earlier, only a few of these photographs were included in the annual reports of the museum. They were not even stored at the archive originally, but instead at the office of the leading excavator. So when discussing these issues with the museum archivist, he flagged a relevant point regarding why these photos were actually preserved. And it is precisely because they were irrelevant and ignored. So they were preserved because they were forgotten. Many times, the photos that were taken during this sort of projects by the museum were sent for publication, and the original photos that were sent to the publishers' houses never came back. And this wasn't general practice until the 1970s, which was terrible because we lost a lot of original photographs, but luckily for us, none of these photographs were sent to publication, and thus they remained in the museum, waiting to be rescued some years later, mostly by chance, as it happens often with this sort of rediscovered materials. No? And finally, we can also ask ourselves why these photos are relevant today. And why we have all gathered here in the context of the Erbil International Book Fair and found it important to do all of these efforts to bring them back to the community and show them back into the Yazidi towns and here in Erbil. And something we have learned throughout this process is how different our approaches to these photographs as Western academics, as non-Yazidis, people not from the community, who have a genuine interest in the region and the traditions of the region and their history, but how different it is when we see these photos from when they're valued by the same community. Now, this talks about heritage values and how both tangible and intangible heritage can be valued by different people at different times for different purposes. So this connects again to the question of why now. No? It has a lot to do with what the community has experienced in the last decade. So after facing total eradication in the hands of Daesh, many aspects of the Yazidi community have changed. And the question of why now also connects to the research question of a project such as the Sersal project. So this project actually becomes a way of studying how many images are recontextualized when recovered and brought back to the community. This is a project that is aimed to generate an archive that goes beyond the preservation of memories and traditions. It reflects on how these photos are received at present and what this reception says about the current situation of the community. So it reflects how, after a genocide that attempted to destroy memory, heritage, traditions, songs, and images of the past become symbols of resistance against the invader. So again, they become symbols of resistance against the fatal threat that Daesh represented to the community. So it redefines memory as a form of resistance in general. And so finally, I told Thomas that we were not going to do any theoretical approach, so I'm going to skip that really fast. But so this approach to the collection of photographs draws a lot on contemporary approaches to image theory, which basically conceptualizes images not as static objects done by one single author, but on how these images are continuously interacting. So by different actors and different environments and with different images. So this approach understands that images are constantly on the move. No? They move in space, they move in time, and they also move between changing contexts and through different media. Nat will later expand a bit more on this aspect. But this is what we call, or what is generally called, social life of images, and this metaphor stands for. So if we focus on the moments that images are reproduced, reinterpreted, or repurposed by the different actors involved in the process, and these actors can be artists, can be us as researchers, can be the Goethe Institute by hosting an institution such as this one, exhibiting these photographs, or it can be all of you within the audience just witnessing this presentation and then later looking at the photographs. So the idea is that every time that the images interact with different observers, they gain new meanings. And so I think we wanted to include a reflection around this, but we don't want to make it too long. It was basically the idea that, so this framework allows us to shed some light on the current relevance of these images, or to understand the why now question, why it is important to bring these photos right now to the community. And right now, Nat will expand a bit on the importance of archiving historical photographs in the aftermath of violence and trauma, and on the role of institutions such as the University of Victoria Libraries in archiving endangered historical material.
Yeah, thank you, Marc. I'm going to keep this relatively brief, I promise, but I do want to reflect a little bit about how photography and archival projects like this, like the Sersal project, are vital, really, in the aftermath of violence, particularly in regions like the one we're dealing with in our work, where the Yazidi community, as well as so many other communities, have dealt with profound trauma. So to give you just a little bit of background about where I'm coming from, I've spent about a decade working as a researcher and documentary photographer, focusing on the consequences of armed conflict. Much of that time was spent in the Kashmir Valley and northwestern India, where I initially worked as a photographer and journalist, and later developed a series of community-based archival projects that really formed the foundation of what became my doctoral work. In recent years, this work has also expanded to include similar initiatives like the one we're working on here in this region, the Sersal project. And in addition to this field work, what I also do is I work at the University of Victoria Libraries, and I have a place called the Center for Global Studies, which are both in Canada, where I'm engaged more in institutional approaches to cultural heritage and archival preservation, really working with developing methods for ethical and collaborative relationships between institutions and communities. So through these experiences, both in South Asia and here, I've had the opportunity to work with and collaborate individuals who have lived through periods of extreme trauma, from war, mass violence, who are seeking ways to document and understand and preserve their histories. Many of you may have yourselves lived through such experiences, so I offer these reflections with humility. What I hope to share are a few insights into what I believe why photographic archiving matters so deeply in these contexts. So at its core, archiving is not just about collecting, organizing, preserving, and making accessible objects or records. I believe it's also really connected to protecting human rights and dignities. In my belief, it is part of an effort to support and affirm the right to be remembered, the right to education, and to the right to freedom of expression and the claim to one's identity and history. In times of conflict and mass violence, cultural heritage sites, including archives, are often deliberately targeted. We've seen this in countless examples around the world, from the destruction of Bosnia's National Library in the 1990s, to ISIS's calculated demolition of historic and religious sites in the Middle East, including sacred Yazidi shrines, to the purposeful destruction of human rights archives and newspaper archives in Kashmir. These acts go beyond physical destruction. They are attempts to sever communities' connections to the past and thereby weakening or erasing a sense of identity and continuity. This destruction, while physical, seems to really create a psychological and cultural break, a delinking of a community's connection to its past. Said it another way, this is a purposeful destruction of collective memory. In this context, archival works are an act of resistance, an effort to push back against the forces of historical and physical destruction. They seek to reconnect the past and the present, and to ensure that the future is not built on silence or loss, but knowledge, memory, and historical continuity, even when this history is difficult and remains contested, as the one we are talking about now. Fundamentally, this is grounded in a belief that everyone has the right to be remembered, and the cultural heritage is inseparable from the broader framework of human rights. As Karima Banoun, the former UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, has emphasized, cultural heritage is not just about a record of the past. It is a resource for the present and a pathway to the future. She argues that the intentional destruction of cultural heritage must be seen as a human rights issue, since it disproportionately affects minority communities and undermines other rights, such as the freedom of expression and cultural participation. This is also enshrined in the Hague Convention of 1954, which recognizes these principles, offering international protection for cultural heritage during conflict. Yet violations persist, particularly in contexts where communities are marginalized, displaced, or persecuted. Importantly, these contexts are also the cases where the least amount of resources are available for institutional, archival, and preservation work. So this is precisely where I believe that photography comes in, as both a method and a medium and a raw resource within archival practice that can play a powerful role in the work of memory and resistance to cultural degradation and erasure. Photographs offer us a uniquely accessible medium, both in terms of creation and interpretation. With the widespread availability of smartphones, something we all have, more people than ever are able to document their lives and communities, even in regions affected by conflict or displacement. This technology has largely democratized image making, allowing individuals to participate in the creation of visual histories without relying solely on outside professionals. Moreover, because photographs communicate across language barriers, with places with varying levels of literacy, they remain an effective medium for storytelling, engaging viewers on both an emotional and intuitive level, and enabling broader participation in the preservation of collective memory. Photography has many histories, it has many meanings, and as Marc noted earlier, photographs possess what scholars sometimes refer to as a social life. They do not exist in isolation or stasis. Rather, they circulate. They are shared, they are kept, forgotten, rediscovered, or even reinterpreted over time. Their meanings shift depending on who is looking at them, when and under what circumstances. For example, when we look at the photographs over here from the Cersil project, each of us will read them differently. Our interpretations are shaped by our own experiences, our varied cultural backgrounds, and by the positions we occupy in relation to the events and communities depicted. Some of us may focus on the technical qualities of the images, others might connect emotionally to a familiar face, a remembered landscape, or a particular gesture captured in time. And yet, even with these diverse readings, photographs hold a particular power. They communicate on multiple levels simultaneously. They show us what was there, a visual trace of something that was real, something that was lived, while also inviting an emotional response that can transcend language or our backgrounds. A photograph may appeal to our empathy, spark a sense of curiosity, or provoke grief. It may become a point of connection or a prompt for dialogue and remembrance. This is what makes photographs especially meaningful in post-conflict settings. It offers a form of communication, while not universal, that is far more accessible than many other forms of documentation. It does not require fluency in a particular language or training in an academic discipline. Instead, it speaks visually, offering us something tangible, immediate, and effective. So photographs serve as historical records. They can help us document the crimes and injustices of war and serve as evidence of wrongs and violations of rights. They can help communities reconstruct timelines, trace lost histories, and assert their presence in narratives from which they might otherwise be excluded. But unlike official documents or reports, photograph can honor the emotional texture of life, of lived experience. They can preserve not only facts, but feelings, the quiet, intimate, and everyday aspects of life that are often erased by dominant accounts of conflict. So within this context here in Erbil, projects like American photographer Susan Meisalas' long-term work in Kurdistan, her books that she created during the 1990s are a good example of this, or local efforts, the ongoing photographic documentation efforts of the Kurdistan Center for Arts and Culture show how images can become central to collective memory, political and national histories. The social project that we are working on right now aspires to a similar goal, not only to preserve images, but to create a space for community-led remembrance, to allow community members the ability to shape their own visual histories, preserve them, and make them accessible for future generations. In this sense, photography is not just about remembering the past, it is also about asserting a future in which a community's identity is not erased, but affirmed, where the traces of violence are not hidden, but made visible and subject to reflection, where healing is pursued through acts of collective recognition. Moreover, photography-based archives encourage plurality of perspectives. They do not claim a single truth, but invite many voices for intergenerational exchange, for education, and for solidarity. And they remind us that history is not fixed. It is shaped by those who choose to remember and how they choose to do so. So finally, to bring this back to some of the deeper ethical and political stakes of this work we're doing, archiving and photography are not neutral acts. There are choices about what is preserved, who is seen, whose stories matter, what is left out. In contexts of mass violence, these choices become even more urgent. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, yeah. They can resist the erasure, they can affirm dignity, and they can lay the foundation for justice and reconciliation, even when formal accountability remains elusive. This is why we believe that this project that we are working on is so important, not only for the Yazidi community, but also as models for post-conflict memory work more broadly, that are grounded in the recognition that cultural heritage is not a side concern, but a human right. These are rights that we must continue to defend, and while photographs alone cannot repair what has been lost, they offer us a starting point, a way of seeing, remembering, and imagining otherwise. Thank you very much.
So, Marco Wackett. So we didn't know if we had time for questions and answers, but if anyone has a question, guess we can just shoot it, and if not, Marco Majal? No? Anyway, please, Mr. Matt. Oh, we need the taqiqa. We need the thing.
باللغة العربية أحكي.
Yeah, بشوف.
عاشت أياديكم ضيف أنتم الشعب على إقليم كردستان والشعب الإيزيدي مديونين لكم. قطعتوا آلاف الكيلومترات وأنتم يعني تكشفون الأرشيف للإيزيديين في أقليم كردستان العراق وخاصة في بعشيقة وبعزاني. طبعا الصورة تنطق وكذلك فإن هذه الصورة يبني المستقبل للإيزيديين. طبعا إيزيديين انغدروا كثير يعني بهذا المنطقة، خاصة مجيء داعش طبعا أرشيف الإيزيديين كلها اندثرت، كلها صار تخريب في أرشيف الإيزيديين، وكذلك حتى متحف الموصل، متحف تاريخي، ومتحف تاريخي طبعا الموصل مدينة أثرية للآشوريين، كذلك للأقوام الأخرى التي سكنت الموصل. نتمنى لكم التوفيق والنجاح في بحثكم هذا، وشكرا.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you. There are no more questions? We can
Yes,
wrap
we're
up?
done. Oh, no, wait,
Oh,
there's
there's
another
another.
person.
دەست خۆش ئەزێ بە کوردی قسە بکەم طبعا جهێ سپاسیە کو هەواکاری ئەرشیفێ ئێزیدیە بپارێزن دوی وەختی هەیە هەستیاردە گەلۆ هوینێ کاربن وی ملەتیژی بپارێزن سپاس
Thank you.
Thanks. خلاص؟ Okay.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much. And yeah, we will leave space for the next round. And please stay until 7 because
Yes, yes.
Museum Music is going to perform.